This is part 2 of a 2-part series on how to install an OME suspension lift on a 2017 Toyota Tacoma. In today's presentation, we'll be showing how to install all the components associated with the rear of the vehicle. Raise the vehicle on a twin-post lift. Remove the driver's side rear wheel assembly by removing the center hubcap, the lug nuts using a 21mm socket, and then the wheel assembly. Loosen the upper shock mount by holding the center shaft with a 6mm open-end wrench and turning the nut using a 14mm ratcheting box-end wrench. Remove the nut, the washer, and the rubber bushing. Remove the passenger side wheel assembly by removing the hubcap, lug nuts, and wheel assembly. Disconnect the passenger side upper shock mount in the same way as shown on the driver's side. Raise the vehicle to a height comfortable to work under. Place an under-hoist jack stand under the rear axle assembly and raise slightly. Disconnect the lower shock mount by holding the bolt with a 17mm box end wrench and removing the nut with a 17mm socket. Remove the washer. Drive the bolt out with a punch and hammer. Remove the shock absorber and set it aside. Begin removing the driver's side U-bolt plate by removing these 4 nuts and washers using a 19mm socket. Remove the U-bolt plate. Remove the front U-bolt and then the rear. Remove the bump stop. Disconnect the park brake cable bracket using a 12mm socket and slide it back out of the way. Lower the rear axle assembly about 2 inches. Be careful not to overstretch these flexible brake lines. Disconnect the front of the leaf spring by holding the nut with a 19mm box end wrench and removing the bolt using a 19mm socket. Then, while supporting the spring, force the bolt out using a pry bar and then remove it. Remove the upper shackle nut by holding the bolt with a 19mm wrench and removing the nut with a 19mm socket. Remove the washer as well. Next, remove the lower shackle nut and washer in the same way as shown on the upper. Rotate the spring and shackle forward. Begin driving the shackle bolts out with a brass hammer. Obtain the tire repair kit from the vehicle and using the jack handle, lower the spare tire. Using a punch and hammer, drive the bolt out the rest of the way. Then remove the leaf spring assembly and set it aside. This arrow indicates the front of the spring or the end of the spring that should be oriented toward the front of the vehicle. Beginning at the opposite end, the rear of the spring, install the supplied bushings using a dead blow hammer. Drive in half of the bushing from one side and the other half from the other side. Next, install the sleeve by supporting the bottom bushing and driving in the sleeve using a dead blow hammer. Ready the other end of the spring by removing the existing bushing. This is done by supporting the spring using a block of wood and driving the bushing out using a 30mm socket and a brass hammer. Once the existing bushing has been removed, install the supplied bushings in the same way as shown earlier. Now install the shackle on the rear of the spring. This is done by fitting the shackle over the bushing and then tapping it into place with the dead blow hammer. Next, install the bolt from the same direction as it was originally. After the bolt is in place, install the washer and then the nut, but leave them loose for now. Place the front spring mount bolt, nut, and washer in your hand. Then position the supplied spring in the vehicle. Position the rear shackle in its approximate location in the rear mount. Then align the front of the spring with the front spring mount and install the bolt. It may be necessary to tap it into place with a brass hammer. Install the washer and then the nut. Leave the nut loose for now. Position the bottom of the shackle in the rear mount. Install the bolt, washer, and then the nut. Leave this nut loose for now as well. Raise the rear axle assembly and align the centering pin of the leaf spring with the hole in the spring perch. Place the bump stop on top of the leaf spring assembly. Install the front supplied U-bolt and then the rear. Install the U-bolt plate in the same orientation as it was originally. Install all 4 supplied washers and nuts. Tighten these nuts in an increasingly tighter crisscross fashion, while at the same time ensuring that the nuts go on at about the same rate, or in other words, the same number of U-bolt threads show below the nuts. Once these nuts are snug, continue tightening in a crisscross manner until 75 foot-pounds is reached. Next, tighten the front spring mount bolt by holding the nut using a 19 mm wrench and tightening the bolt to 89 foot-pounds. Tighten the rear upper shackle bolt in the same way. Do not tighten the lower shackle bolt at this point. That will be done later. Turn the supplied shock upside down, press it against the floor, and remove the shipping restraint. On the upper end of the shock, install a supplied washer, bushing, and centering washer. Beginning on the driver's side, position the upper end of the shock in its approximate location. Start the bottom of the shock in the lower shock mount and tap it into place using a dead blow hammer. Align the holes with the tapered end of the pry bar and install the supplied bolt, washer, and nut. While holding the bolt with a 17 mm wrench, torque the nut to 43 foot-pounds. The upper end of the shock will be connected later. Install the passenger side leaf spring and shock absorber by following the same procedure shown on the driver's side. Once the passenger side is complete, remove the underhoist jack stand. Place the underhoist jack stand under the carrier bearing for support. Remove both support bolts, first the driver's side and then the passenger side. Lower the carrier bearing slightly. Place one of the supplied spacers between the carrier bearing and the frame. Install the longer supplied bolt, flat washer, and lock washer. Install the driver's side spacer, bolt, flat washer, and lock washer. Snug both bolts and then torque them to 27 foot-pounds. Once the bolts are tight, remove the underhoist jack stand. Once the carrier bearing spacers have been installed, lower the vehicle. Once the hoist is at a good working height, install the passenger side wheel assembly and lug nuts. Snug the lug nuts in a progressively tighter crisscross pattern. Install the driver's side wheel assembly and lug nuts and snug them in the same way. Raise the spare tire back in the stored position and put the jack handle away. Continue lowering the vehicle until the tires begin to press against the floor. Guide the upper shock stem through the upper shock mount on both sides and continue lowering the vehicle. Once the shock bushing is properly seated in the mount on both sides, stop lowering the vehicle. Beginning on the passenger side, install the supplied rubber bushing, washer, and nut. While holding the center shaft with a 6 mm open-end wrench, tighten the nut using a 14 mm ratcheting box end wrench. Continue tightening until the rubber bushing bulges to a diameter equal to the washer diameter. Connect the driver's side upper shock mount following the same procedure as shown on the passenger side. Torque both rear wheel assemblies in a progressively tighter crisscross pattern until 87 foot-pounds is reached, and install both hubcaps. Continue lowering the vehicle until the vehicle is no longer supported by the lift. Before tightening the lower shackle bolts, bounce the vehicle up and down several times to ensure that the bushings are stabilized. Once the bushings are stabilized, torque the lower shackle bolts to 89 foot-pounds on both sides. Please be aware that even though the alignment cams were put back in their original position, this vehicle will require a professional four-wheel alignment upon completion of this lift installation. Failure to do so will likely result in poor handling, abnormal braking, and excessive tire tread wear. Additionally, we typically get a lot of questions about before and after measurements. So here are the results. All measurements given are taken from the ground to the fender. Before the lift was installed, we measured 36 3/4 inches in the rear and 34 7/8 in the front. After installing the Old Man EMU suspension and keeping the original tires and rims, we measured 39 1/4 in the rear and 37 7/8 in the front. That was an increase of 2.5 inches in the rear and 3 inches in the front. Then we installed these aftermarket rims and 33-inch tires and measured it again. The rear measured 40 1/4 inches and the front was 38 7/8. That would be a 3.5 inch increase in the rear and 4 inch increase in the front. Comparing the front to the rear, we measured 1 1/2 inches higher in the rear. That concludes today's presentation. We hope these instructions have been helpful. We remind you that all the parts and supplies required for this job can be purchased through our website at www.lowrangeoffroad.com or by calling 801-805-6644.